Hi everyone and welcome to today's episode. This is part 2 of my trip to the Faroes. If you haven't seen the first episode, I suggest you go back and check it out. But for those who can't, let me catch you up. So after our engine disaster which cancelled our trip on Hat Trick this year, I decided to hook up with two strangers, Jim and Florcher, and jump aboard Jim's boat Skyline to take a trip from Scotland to the Faroe Islands. In the last episode we met up, had a chance to look around and get used to the boat, had two pretty rousing days sailing on the way up to Stornoway before tying up at Stornoway to provision the boat, cook up some food for the trip, and then we settled down for one last night tied to the land before we set sail. When we awoke the next morning, we were treated to a warm but overcast start to the day. We had one last thing to do before we could head off, which was to fuel up Skyline, so we took her over to the fuel berth. Right by the fuel berth there was a couple of very fat and I'm assuming lazy seals who were feeding up on the scraps from the fishing boat. These seals had clearly figured out the best way to live their lives. Having the scraps. We knew there was a high chance we might not get a lot of wind on this trip, so we brimmed Skyline's tanks to the top, and once they had as much fuel as they could carry, we threw off the lines and headed out. As we headed out and left Stornoway, I must admit there was a little bit of nerves creeping in, as particularly for myself and Florcher, this was the first time that we'd ever really headed out into open water and out to a point where there would be no land in sight. But our course was set and entered into the navigation. Once we had got past Harris and Lewis, our course would be essentially straight north for around 240 miles, which based on the engine speed would take around 40 hours, but obviously this would change depending on the conditions ahead. The first leg of the journey saw us heading up the east side of Harris and Lewis, and as predicted, particularly whilst in the Louis of the Islands, we had virtually no wind, so it was engine all the way. Despite having no wind to sail on though, this was a nice part of the trip. The sea was very calm, the weather was pleasant, and we were able just to enjoy and watch the scenery fly by. Fortunately though, as the day went on and we left the Louis of the Islands, we did manage to pick up a little bit of wind and get the sails out. Unfortunately though, we also started to pick up quite a bit of swell, but with the sails on and the boat under power, it wasn't actually too bad and we were cutting along quite nicely. Despite the wind dropping off as the day progressed, we kept the sails out for as long as possible, partly because we just wanted to do as much sailing as possible, knowing that we would probably end up on the engine, but also as we were now fully at the mercy of the North Atlantic swell, having the sails helps to sort of stabilise the boat and stop it rocking around quite a bit, and we knew as soon as we took them up down we'd be in for a rocky trip. Despite this hope though, as the evening started to draw in and the sun started to dip towards the horizon, we completely lost the wind and were forced to take down the sails. At which point, as predicted, it started to get a lot rockier as we were being tossed from side to side by this Atlantic swell. It was, however, a beautiful evening with nice glassy water as we headed to our first and pretty much only landmark on the trip, which would be North Rona Island, which is situated about 55 miles north of Scotland, completely on its own. Despite the disappointment of not being able to sail though, we still had a beautiful evening and got to witness a beautiful sunset through the broken clouds as that sun dipped below the oily water. As the resident night owl, I'd agreed to do the night shift, that way everyone else could sleep on a normal pattern and I would just get a few hours sleep during the day. So I had a couple of hours kip in the evening, and then Flortia carried on till midnight when I took over to take the boat through the night. It was a pretty uneventful night, there wasn't much going on, it was very calm, we were under motor, so I generally just sat on deck, keeping an eye on things, making sure no big ships came by, and watching films on my tablet. There was a full moon which every now and again peeked out from behind the clouds, which made for a really beautiful if not eerie experience of seeing nothing but dark water all around you illuminated by the moon. And it's the first time that I'd been this far out to sea and at night. It was quite a wonderful experience. We did have a relatively close encounter, and by that I mean around about a mile away off the stern, with a very large cargo ship. But beyond that, it was a pretty easy night. Although it was good weather, when you're sitting on the deck all night in the cold, blankets and lots of waterproofs are very much appreciated. As the sun rose and the fulmars started to play around the boat again, I turned in for the night and let the others take over. I awoke to a beautiful sunny day around lunchtime and had myself a nice bit of food which the guys had prepared. The weather today was a beautiful sunny day, not quite crystal clear blue skies but close enough. The water was oily with the lack of wind, although there was still quite the swell coming in. With Skyline's engine and autopilot doing all the work, there was very little for us to do but sit back, relax and enjoy the view. In the lead up to this trip, I was concerned that we might be facing big storms and snow and rainfall and who knows what as we headed this far north, but as it turned out it was a beautiful, very calm, sunny experience, with the only real thing to contend with the rolling, which did lead to a bit of testing of our sea legs, but I think everyone did their best to keep their lunch where it was meant to be. And this is how the day went on, just rolling back and forth, listening to the hum of the engine and relaxing as best we could. Despite only being about 24 hours into the trip now, we'd all settled into it pretty well and were, I think, catching up on sleep from the fairly exciting day the previous day. I know I certainly got some Zeds out in the cockpit, as did Jim. Despite the lack of wind and calm conditions though, we had made progress and were chewed away the miles down to about 80 miles left, or 16 hours ish depending on the conditions, as we went into the following night. As per the previous night, I would be taking the night shift and took over from Flortia around midnight. As the sun started to set, we got our first glimpses of the lights towards the Faroes, being the lighthouse on the southern tip. And as the night progressed, more and more lights started to appear before us. There was also a fair bit more to do whilst on watch, because as we approached the Faroes we were also approaching the fairly notorious and treacherous tidal flows that whip around the Faroes, and that required a lot of course adjustments as we were being pushed off to the east constantly and also being pushed backwards, getting down to around 2.5 knots speed at times. However, as the sun started to peek over the horizon, we were heading around the southern tip of the island, so it was time to put up our courtesy flag and our quarantine flag, which we would have to have up until we checked in with the immigration services on the Faroes. With the blazing sunrise behind us, we turned into the fjord towards our first stop, which would be Vágur. Despite being pretty tired after a long night, it was great to be nearing our destination and also seeing the beautiful houses dotted around the hillside on the way into Vágur. Jim and Flortia joined us on deck, obviously excited also to get the trip finished, and we drifted onto the beautiful Millpond Fjord on our way into the centre. We passed the main breakwater into the inner part of the fjord and started to look around for somewhere where we could tie up for the day. In the end, we settled with tying up against the main wall in the inner harbour. It was fairly quiet, there weren't too many boats around, so there was plenty of space for us to tuck Skyline in. And that was it, we tied up, we jumped ashore, and we had made it. We had crossed to the Faroe Islands. Despite it only being about 5 o'clock in the morning and us all being a little bit tired and jaded, we decided to go for a walk and explore around the town of Vágur. I found this memorial to people who have been lost at sea, and all over the town you could see the deep connection with the sea, pretty much every single thing being related to it, including the latch on this gateway into the beautiful modern church that was built here in around 1939. On the way back to the boat, we spotted this large boat heading out, which we later found out was actually one of the service/tender boats for the many fish farms that we'd passed on the way into Vágur. Having been awake all night, I decided to turn in at this point, and then later on when I woke, I decided to go and explore the other side of the island. Now often that would be a daunting walk, but on this part of the island was only about half a mile wide, so it only took me about 10 minutes to walk up to the other side, past this statue which I still don't know what it was about, and this little lake that existed between the two shorelines. Up on the hill above the lake, I got a good view back down the valley towards where Skyline was moored, before I treated to the view of the rugged western side of the island. Gone were the rolling green hills of the eastern side. Here where the Faroes meets the Atlantic Ocean, you could see the difference in the dramatic coastline. This bay looks beautiful, and I was hoping to go snorkeling here, but I was kind of fearful of the notorious tides that rush up and down the coast, and I was a bit too tired to risk diving into this freezing cold water, so my snorkeling ambitions would have to wait till later. I was kind of surprised that they'd never thought about building a canal between the two sides, given it was such a short distance. However, on looking at the information boards, I saw that there was actually once a cable car overhead ropeway type thing, which they used for carrying both materials and supplies as well as boats from one side of the island to the other, and there were even remnants of it left on the cliffside. I hope you enjoyed following us on this part of the trip. In the next episode we'll be leaving Vágur behind and heading north towards Tórshavn, the capital of the Faroe Islands. As well as touring the beautiful Tórshavn, we leave Skyline behind and head across land to explore some of the other islands and the amazing features that exist there. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, remember to subscribe and like and all that jazz, and I will see you in the next episode.